Chapter 7: Fallacies of Language and Meaning. Introduction. If you keep your ears perked, you can hear bizarre-sounding statements these days. Here are a couple we've heard. The patient did not fulfill his wellness potential. It was a therapeutic misadventure of the highest degree. Do you know what these statements mean? Possibly not. Simply put, both statements were used as roundabout ways of saying the patient died. Our best guess is that the people who formulated these statements were not much interested in clarity of expression or rational persuasion. More likely, they were using language here to conceal meaning, and that's not at all unusual. Much attention has been focused in recent years on the state of language in North America. Writers like Edwin Newman, William Safire, and Robert McNeill have written about the state of language use, calling attention to doublespeak, psychobabble, jargon, and other varieties of verbal trumpery and campaigning for improvement in language skills. They have insightfully documented the many ways in which people use language to cloak meaning and avoid responsibility. In this chapter, we too will be concerned with language, primarily insofar as it affects the practice of argumentation. We are not concerned with details such as the aberrant use of the word hopefully that seems to have gained currency. Rather, we are concerned with abuses that weaken the practice of argumentation. Before we look at these abuses, however, we want to say a few words about how to process the language of argumentation. One of the first steps in evaluating an argument, and this applies to other forms of reasoning as well, is determining when the meaning of a claim or a term under consideration is unclear. Before you can judge whether a premise is relevant to a conclusion, or before you can determine whether a given claim is acceptable, you need to know what it means, and you have to know how to clarify the claim if it is unclear. Finally, you have to deal with other types of problems that arise because of the language used. Argumentation as a practice depends upon language, and so participants in the practice must learn proper respect for language. A master woodworker keeps her tools clean, sharp, and oiled, and uses them properly. The same should be true for anyone engaged in the practice of argumentation. Words are the symbols used in argumentation to express basic points, the conclusion, and the basis for them, the premises. When you engage in the practice of argumentation, the onus is on you to use words in such a way as to convey your meaning clearly and unambiguously. Thus, we might say that the use of language in argumentation is subject to two basic principles. 1. Be clear, since the purpose of argumentation is to bring about rational acceptance of the conclusion on the basis of the premises. The arguer has a responsibility to be clear in formulating the material of the argument, the premises, and the conclusion. We cannot be persuaded rationally by a claim whose meaning is unclear to us. 2. Be responsible. Since argumentation aims at rational persuasion, it is important that the arguer use language responsibly. The arguer needs to say what he or she means and should mean what he or she says. It's important to be responsible. If an arguer uses a term with an emotional or judgmental component to it, he must first earn the right to use it by showing that the evidence needed to support that dimension is available. The first group of fallacies we discuss are violations of the first principle. The remaining fallacy, the freeloading term, violates the second. A word about logic and rhetoric. Our concern in this text is with the logic rather than the rhetoric of argumentation. Rhetoric is the art of putting thoughts into language in evocative and forceful ways. A piece of discourse can be rhetorically effective yet logically weak. The classic example of this situation would be the speeches of Adolf Hitler, which were, if we were to judge by their effect, compelling to German audiences at the time, and yet from a logical point of view they are shot through with weak assumptions and problematic premises. On the other hand, an argument can be logically cogent but rhetorically ineffective, for example, if it fails to take proper account of its audience. Conclusions should be adequately supported, and the resulting arguments should be presented so as to be convincing to their audiences. In our experience, logicians tend to underestimate the importance of the audience and the context to the comprehension and evaluation of argumentation. Rhetoric as a discipline has important insights about argumentation that logicians need to embrace. Ideally, our arguments should be both logically compelling and rhetorically appealing. Once you become attuned to the way language is used and abused, you will discover that discourse can sound quite impressive and mean next to nothing. Here's an example from a press conference given by Alexander Haig, the former Secretary of State, in which he said, quote, "I think the issue is that we do have a tendency to indulge in episodic preoccupation, if you will, with one another on the strategic horizon." End quote. Possibly, if we knew more about the context in which this statement was made, we would see some shred of meaning here, but we confess to being stumped. Let us cite another example. Suppose that in a report about a company's financial situation you read the following: "The problem with the gradient parameters is functional rather than systemic and hence can be expected to impact negatively on the emergent matrix." Sounds impressive, right? Would it surprise you to learn that we constructed the sentence, if you can call it that, by consulting something called the jargon generator, which has appeared in various formats and publications? This list contains 3 columns, each containing 10 meaty, polysyllabic words such as parameter, gradient, functional, and so on. By combining words from each column, we produced the sentence above, which, unless your guard is up, you might allow to pass by without challenge, probably on the grounds that the person who wrote it must have known what he or she was talking about. The lesson here is this: a sentence that sounds impressive does not necessarily make sense. The amount of semantic inflation in our linguistic culture these days, where there is talk of wellness potential, downward adjustments, and negative enhancement, means that there will be times when you will have to run the risk of being thought stupid by saying, "Pardon me, I didn't quite understand what you just said. Could you repeat it in simpler terms?" The opposite situation also occurs. Discourse that sounds opaque or dense can actually be quite meaningful. Here is a passage from Soren Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death. What is the self? The self is a relation. The self is not the relation, but rather that in the relation which accounts for it, that the self relates itself to its own self. The language Kierkegaard uses here is convoluted, to be sure. To grasp its meaning, you have to work through this text, seeing it in its context and in relation to the larger point. Even though at first glance it might seem to be nothing but words, it has an intelligible core. Though it would take us outside the scope of this text to defend our exegesis of what Kierkegaard means in the above text, we take him to be saying that the self is not a thing, not a substance, not anything like an object at all. The self is more like a relationship than it is like a thing. Though you must learn to rely on your own sense of when something is clear and when it isn't, you cannot rely completely on your first impressions to decide whether some obscure discourse is nonsense. Read the argument carefully, consider the text, and try to find the sense in what was argued. Develop hypotheses about what it might mean, and then check them out. In looking over an argument, and the same advice applies to most other kinds of reasoning as well, to determine its clarity, we suggest the following policies. Policy 1. Focus on the crucial claims and terms in the argument. Time is short. You cannot possibly dwell on each and every word of an argument you are considering. Instead, practice scanning an argument to identify its crucial terms. How will you find them? Start with the conclusion, the single most important claim in the argument, for that is what the writer is trying to persuade you of. Look first at the conclusion and its important words or terms, usually the subject and the predicate. Next in line will be the main premises or reasons offered to support the conclusion and the terms prominent in them. In short, simple arguments, the crucial terms are usually easy to find. Consider this example. Ellen is so responsible. She's always looking out for other people. In the conclusion, the crucial terms are Ellen and responsible. Presumably, the context will make it clear who Ellen is, but the term responsible might create a problem. In the premise, the crucial term is looking out for, and again, you would want to make sure that you knew what the arguer meant here. In longer arguments, it is much more difficult to determine which terms are crucial. It requires the capacity to process units of the text while retaining the sense of what you've read. We still believe that it's good advice to look at the conclusion, identify the important terms in it, and ask yourself whether they're clear. Next, you need to look at the premises that contribute directly to the conclusion. Zero in on their important terms and see whether they're clear. Policy 2. Ask yourself, is it clear? Once you've identified the crucial terms, you need to ask yourself whether they are clear. Do you understand their meaning? Don't confuse this question with others, such as, is the claim true? Is there enough evidence for it? It is possible to grasp the meaning of a claim even though you regard it as false. In fact, if you don't understand the claim, you don't know what you're disagreeing with. If the answer is yes, I understand these terms, then you provisionally take it as clear. Proceed to ask how well the evidence supports the conclusion. If the answer is no, I'm not sure what some of these terms mean, I don't really grasp what's being said, then there are a number of possible explanations. It might be that there's a problem of meaning in the passage. Below, we discuss the most common of these problems. It's also possible that the reason the terms are unclear is that your own brain isn't in gear. Either you're in a mental fog, not paying sufficient attention, or you don't know enough about the subject. In other words, sometimes the explanation for a claim not being clear lies in the receiver. Here are some tests for clarity. 1. A statement is clear to you if you can restate its meaning in other words that express the same meaning. If you didn't have the right lexicon to decode the pair of statements that opened this chapter, you probably would not know what they meant. That's okay, because those statements are intentionally opaque. They are attempts to conceal meaning, to give the appearance of having said one thing while in fact saying something else. The patient did not fulfill his wellness potential sounds perhaps like he did not get as well as expected. It sounds nothing at all like he died. And even if you are familiar with phrases like wellness potential, it's unlikely you'd know what was meant here. 2. A statement is clear to you if you know the conditions under which it would be true and the conditions under which it would be false. One way that we can be sure we've understood a statement is to offer potential verifiers and falsifiers. To illustrate this point, contrast Coke has a slight flavor of clove with Coke is it. You probably know what experiences would verify the first statement. Assuming that you are familiar with the taste of clove, you would open a bottle, sip, and pay attention to the taste for that hint of clove. If you tasted it, that would serve to verify the statement. If not, that would serve to falsify it. Neither experience would be definitive, but the ability to imagine the relevance of each helps us grasp the meaning. You could also smell or taste clove and then try some Coke to see whether there's any similarity. What about the second statement? What would serve to falsify or verify it? What does it refer to? Does it mean the best soft drink? The soft drink you'd like to have right now? A perfectly acceptable soft drink, or what? It's not at all clear, and, consequently, neither is the statement. 3. A statement is clear if competent users of the language would come up with approximately the same responses when asked to state the meaning. There is a different and even better sort of test of clarity, but more difficult to apply. It stems from the idea that language is an intersubjective experience. Meaning is an intersubjective phenomenon. When several people read or hear a statement and all get pretty much the same meaning from it, that indicates a clearly formulated statement. Ask someone else what they get from the statement, and if you both get the same meaning, that's one indicator that it's clear. We suggest these 3 strategies as potentially helpful methods for determining whether the meaning of a statement, your own or someone else's, is clear. Constant vigilance is the price of clarity. You have to be ready to press for clarity at all times in your own thinking, reading, and writing, no less than in that of others. If the discourse is unclear, and that unclarity is, to the best of your ability to judge, not due to defects in your own knowledge or thinking, then you need to do what you can to make it clear. Policy 3. Where possible, seek clarification. If you have a problem grasping the meaning of a claim in an argumentative text, there are steps you can take. If the claim you're investigating was made by someone not present, then the task is much more difficult. If you can talk to the person, there are several things you can do to get clarification. 1. You can ask the individual to reformulate the claim in a different way by asking, "Could you please state your point in different words?" 2. You can ask for an explanation of a crucial term by saying, for example, "I'm not sure what obfuscate means. Could you tell me?" Or, "I'm having trouble understanding what you mean by freedom in this context. Could you please explain it to me?" 3. You can ask for an example or an illustration by saying, for example, "You said that love means never having to say you're sorry. Could you give me an example to help me understand?" Or you might present an apparent counterexample and ask the person to respond to that. "What about when you hurt someone you love? Does that mean you don't have to apologize?" If you can't get the necessary clarification from the arguer, then the best you can do is to hypothesize what the unclear statement means, then test your hypothesis and compare it against alternatives. You should, of course, check unfamiliar terms in the dictionary, but that's no help when you encounter familiar terms used in puzzling ways. If the statement remains opaque, then consider the hypothesis that the problem is the arguer's rather than yours. Fallacies related to meaning. If attempts to clarify the term fail, that may signal a problem with the meaning of the claim. Below, we discuss 4 common problems related to meaning. 3 of them, ambiguity, equivocation, and vagueness, are instances of lack of clarity. The 4th, which we call the freeloading term, occurs when the arguer uses a term before having earned the right to use it, thus violating the principle of responsible language use. About dictionaries and definitions. Consulting a dictionary is clearly mandated when you are just plain unfamiliar with the word, or when, though you are familiar with it, you sense that it is being used in a new or odd way. People sometimes abuse or misuse words, and the best possible way to check against this is by having a good dictionary and using it. Don't try to guess what an unfamiliar word means, look it up. On the other hand, you cannot expect a dictionary to shed sufficient light on or resolve issues that involve the meanings of important concepts or ideas. The current debate about what constitutes pornography, for example, exists because people have very different concepts of pornography. No appeal to a dictionary can settle the issue. If it could, then it would have been settled a long time ago. A good dictionary can report the uses of the word pornography, but it is unlikely to help settle a dispute. What is needed to resolve or clarify such disputes is careful analysis and argumentation. To equivocate is to use a term in one sense in one part of your argument and then, without signaling it, to turn around and switch meanings, using it in a different sense elsewhere in the same argument. Such argumentation is fallacious. For equivocation to occur, a term must be susceptible to having more than one meaning. Thus, equivocation is a cousin of ambiguity. Webster defines ambiguous as capable of being understood in two or more possible senses. We distinguish between the occurrence of ambiguity in discourse and the fallacy of ambiguity in argumentation. Ambiguity. Ambiguity occurs when a word that is susceptible of two or more meanings is unclear in the context. That is, the context does not provide sufficient information to determine which meaning is intended. There is nothing wrong with words having multiple meanings. Most English words do, including the word word. This feature of our language can be used to great effect, as, for example, when Public Broadcasting Service newscaster Jim Lehrer, in an address to the graduating class at Southern Methodist University in 1989, said, quote, "I urge you to please keep in mind what the diploma you are about to receive does not mean. It does not mean you are educated. Quite the contrary. It means, I hope, that you have been opened up to a perpetual state of ignorance." End quote. The shock value and, indeed, the real force of Lehrer's admonition depend on the multiple senses of the term education. In one sense of the term, the graduates certainly had received an education. They had completed a course of studies at an institution of higher education. The degree they were about to receive was proof of that, but Lehrer wanted to remind them that there was another sense in which they were still far from educated. They had just begun to learn. To do this, he relied on the multiple meanings, the ambiguity of the word education. He was not guilty here of the fallacy of ambiguity because there was no argument trading on the ambiguity. The fact of multiple meanings creates a problem only when the speaker or writer exploits the feature, whether in argument or elsewhere. The fallacy of ambiguity occurs when the ambiguity is an impediment to understanding or assessing an argument. The defining conditions of the fallacy of ambiguity are listed in the box. Ambiguity. 1. A term with two different meanings is used in the argument. 2. In the context, it is not possible to decide which meaning is intended. In the 1992 presidential campaign, Bush said on one occasion that homosexuality was not normal. This is an ambiguous claim. It could mean either that homosexuality is not the normal situation, which is true, or it could mean that homosexuality is an abnormal and unnatural condition, which is false if it suggests that homosexuality is not found in other parts of nature. Now, were this claim part of an argument, we would be in a position to charge ambiguity. Equivocation. As we indicated above, equivocation occurs when the same word or phrase undergoes an unsignaled shift in meaning during one piece of discourse or argument. Here is an example. In 1982, before the Chicago Bears became a National Football League powerhouse, a disgruntled fan brought a suit against the Bears, charging them with false advertising. Her argument went, in part, like this. They advertise themselves as a professional team, but they do not play a very professional game. Look at all the mistakes they make each game. The argument is based on equivocation on the word professional. The conclusion of this argument is that the Bears are not a professional team. The evidence is that they do not play like professionals. The writer can get to this conclusion only by exploiting the two senses of the term professional, in effect shifting its meaning. In its first occurrence, professional means something like receiving payment for its performance or services, as contrasted with amateurs who are not paid. The Bears certainly were a professional team in that sense in 1982, but professional also means performing well and skillfully in the manner expected of those paid, which is the meaning the writer invokes in the second occurrence. In this sense, a professional team may not play like professionals. That is, they may play poorly. That doesn't mean they aren't still professional in the first sense. The reasoning here exploits this shift in meaning. It seems plausible to the degree that we fail to notice the equivocation. The implicit conclusion, the Bears should not call themselves a professional team, requires that professional mean paid money for their services. But the premise the Bears do not play a very professional game is plausible only if professional is taken to mean highly skilled. That's the switch that makes this a case of equivocation. If professional is taken throughout in the sense in which the premise is plausible, then the conclusion doesn't follow. On the other hand, if professional is taken throughout in the sense in which the conclusion would follow, then the premise taken that way becomes false. The defining conditions of the fallacy of equivocation are listed in the box. Equivocation. 1. A term is used in two different senses, either in two different premises or in a premise and the conclusion of an argument. That is, the statements in which this term occurs are intelligible only if the term they share appears in a different sense in each. 2. If the term is used consistently throughout the arguments, then either the premise in which it occurs is acceptable, but the other premise or conclusion is not, or the conclusion is acceptable but the premise is not. Here is another example. When men of draft age went to Canada in the late 1960s to avoid serving in the United States Army, which was then engaged in war in Vietnam, some argued that Canada should not allow them to immigrate. Then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau took the opposite view, arguing that, quote, "I think the only ultimate guide we have is our conscience, and if the law of the land goes against our conscience, I think we should disobey the law." End quote. In response, an editorialist for the Windsor Star argued, "The point of the matter is that Trudeau has the business of law and conscience mixed up. Not conscience, but law is the ultimate guide. Without law there could be no conscience. When a man thinks a certain law violates his conscience, it is only because there is some other law on the same subject that he believes should be followed." As support for the claim that law, not conscience, is the ultimate guide, the writer puts forth the assertion that when a man thinks a certain law violates his conscience, it is only because there is some other law on the same subject that he believes should be followed. We think the editorialist uses law equivocally here. In the first part of his statement, we take law to be referring to statutory law. An example here would be a law in the South that forbade black people from riding on the front of a bus. Note that the second half of the statement contains a reference to law that makes sense only if we take the editorialist to be referring to something like moral law. So if the first reference to law is to be true, it must be taken to refer to statutory law. The second reference must be to something like moral law. The arguer thus shifts the meaning of the term law within this statement, thereby committing equivocation. The litmus test for equivocation is to look for a term that occurs twice. In order for a term's meaning to shift in the discourse of an argument, the term must appear in at least two places. Put differently, when one term occurs repeatedly or plays a central role in an argument, you need to make sure that it is being used the same way each time it occurs. Vagueness. The next fallacy related to meaning that we take up is vagueness, a problem related to but different from ambiguity. Vagueness creates a problem for us as arguers, much the way that a blurry image presents a problem to us as perceivers. Suppose you are walking along a path through a park at night. You see a shape looming in the distance, but you don't know what it is. You just see an indistinct shape. That may present a rather serious problem depending on where the park is located and what local conditions are like. Is it a mugger, someone exercising, or nothing at all? The lack of clarity about what you're seeing makes it difficult to determine its significance. Similarly, when someone makes a claim and the meaning of that claim is unclear, and the lack of clarity is not due to any fault in you as the interpreter, that is the situation we call vagueness. The following letter illustrates how vagueness creates problems. I am currently in the 10th grade, and I agree wholeheartedly that physical science is not learned well. The chief problem, as I see it, is teaching methods. We are taught simply to memorize a formula and then regurgitate it in a test or examination. As a result, we forget almost everything we learn until the next year. Furthermore, even if there is a thinking question on a test, a clever student can pull the wool over the teacher's eyes. I often hand in projects I consider to have little or no scientific merit. They usually receive top marks. In short, the educational system needs a thorough overhaul, not only in the physical sciences, but in all areas of study. One difficulty here is in knowing exactly what the writer means by a thorough overhaul of the educational system. Is the arguer referring to secondary education, to primary and secondary education, to college education? He or she has been speaking here mainly of teaching methods and problems related to teaching. Does the writer also believe that the organization of the curriculum is problematic? Does the writer believe that school should be a year-round affair, as it is in Japan? Should there be admission standards at the elementary and secondary level? All of these are conceivably within the meaning of a thorough overhaul. It is difficult to assess the writer's argument here because we are not exactly sure how to take the conclusion. Another example, from a letter to the Detroit Free Press, concerns the question of whether capital punishment should be carried out in Michigan, which presently does not allow it. The writer states, "It looks like the politicians don't want the voters to decide whether we should have capital punishment. I believe the voters should have more to say about everything. For this reason, I say that if the legislature and others do not put capital punishment on the ballot, we should throw them out of office. The most important thing to do is vote, and show that you can throw them out. I am angry because for a long time I have believed that the criminal element is running this country." Clearly, the arguer thinks that capital punishment should be on the ballot in Michigan and that any politicians opposing this idea should be thrown out of office. What is not clear here is the last statement. What does the writer mean by the criminal element? Does the writer mean that organized crime or the mafia is running the country? Are we to take the writer's meaning to be that the president and the Congress are part of that criminal element, or, at the least, have been bought out? And what does it mean to be part of the criminal element? The context does not help us answer these questions, which points the finger at the claim as vague. Our next example of vagueness is taken from an article in USA Today. The eminent American historian Henry Steele Commager here discusses the issue of how historians will view the current stock of presidents. I don't know about future historians, but historians today generally think poorly of most of our recent presidents. We can't blame Ford because he was appointed to the job to rescue the nation, but in any list of presidents, Nixon must be at the bottom. There is no question about that. He was the only really dangerous president we ever had. He was the only really contemptible president we had. The claim that Nixon is at the bottom of the list is supported by the claim that he was the only really dangerous president the United States ever had. The problem here is that it's not at all clear what it means to say that Nixon was really dangerous. The problem isn't that we don't know in general what really dangerous means. We know what it means to say that drunk drivers are really dangerous, that experimenting with crack cocaine is really dangerous, that trying to defuse bombs is a really dangerous enterprise, and so on. But that knowledge is of no help in determining Commager's meaning. This inability to determine meaning makes it impossible for the reader to evaluate the premise and, as a result, the argument itself. The vagueness of the claim impedes our understanding of the premise and is thus objectionable. Vagueness should be distinguished from ambiguity and equivocation. In both ambiguity and vagueness, there is a lack of clarity stemming from the language used. In ambiguity, the possible meanings can be pinned down to two, but the context doesn't allow you to decide which of the two is intended. Vagueness is more open-ended. There is a range of possible meanings, none of which is clearly indicated by the context. In a case of equivocation, the terms undergo a shift in meaning within a given context. The problem here is not that the terms lack a clear meaning, but rather that they have been used in two clearly different senses. Vagueness should also be distinguished from the phenomenon known as euphemism, which substitutes indirect and usually softer language for harsh expression. A classic example is the reference to someone as having passed away rather than died. Thus construed, euphemism is not so much a lack of clear meaning as it is an attempt to soften the impact. It creates a problem when the reader is unfamiliar with the euphemism or when it shades off in the direction of not merely softening but concealing meaning. The substitution of a phrase like detention center for concentration camp, for example, not only softens meaning but actually conceals it. Euphemism should be distinguished from what we call obfuscation, the deliberate use of unclear or misleading language to cloak or conceal meaning. One of the statements that opens this chapter, "It was therapeutic misadventure of the highest degree," when what is meant is that the patient died, is not euphemism, which attempts to soften meaning, but rather a deliberate attempt to conceal meaning. We also need to distinguish between vagueness and jargon. Jargon is special, sometimes technical vocabulary often associated with a discipline, profession, or craft. This language is unclear to the uninitiated, and the problem with its use is not so much logical as rhetorical, i.e., it is used inappropriately. This excerpt from a letter from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard illustrates what we're talking about. Dear colleague, I need your assistance in a study I am conducting of the voluntary or selective marginal situation, a sought-after situation that entails being on the margins of two social positions, attitudinal dispositions, or ideological commitments, but a full member or adherent of neither, and which enables individuals to differentiate themselves from others who share their social positions, values, and attitudes. Without further elaboration, it is difficult to know what exactly is meant by this phraseology, but the terminology may be stock in trade for the audience at whom it is directed, for example, sociologists or communication theorists. Outside such a context, it would certainly be objectionably vague. We are most concerned with vagueness insofar as it affects argumentation, but we want to call your attention to two other places where vagueness often resides, in clichés and advertising. Consider the meaning of this cliché. Everyone has a right to his or her opinion. What does this mean exactly? Is the right in question here a legal right? No. There are no such laws, though there are laws regarding the expression of opinion. Is the right in question a moral right? If I attempt to deny your opinion, or your right to it, have I offended a moral law? That doesn't seem right. Is it some other kind of right? Clichés have enough truth and meaning to get by in some circumstances, which is why they are in wide use, but they are often not clear enough to survive scrutiny, and certainly not strong enough to stand as the premises of an argument without further clarification. As for advertising, consider the current slogan for Pepsi Cola, "Gotta have it." This was introduced with much hoopla during the telecast of Super Bowl 27 in January 1992. One presumes that it means that the person in question has to have a Pepsi Cola. But wait, can this be serious? What kind of have to is this? Is Pepsi Cola addictive? No, not really. Is this a matter of wants? Okay, so the person wants a Pepsi, so what? Really, the slogan amounts to words that in this expression have very little meaning, but that can be used as a kind of focal point for all kinds of fancy effects and imagery, as the rest of the commercial shows. To sum up, the conditions of the fallacy of vagueness are as shown in the box. Vagueness. 1. An argument contains a premise or a conclusion whose meaning is indeterminate in that context. 2. The indeterminateness of the statement makes it impossible to assess its acceptability as a premise or its significance as a conclusion. Vagueness is called by many names, and calling attention to it is not unheard of in ordinary argumentative discourse. Witness its occurrence in the following letter to the Toronto Star, May 1989. Re. When is poverty a case of relative inequality? I must express how unclear the term relative inequality remains to myself as a Canadian. After all, Britain and the United States have governments very similar, and citizens of all three countries must feel many of the same pressures. The best idea of our human condition has little to do with economics and much more to do with the quality of living. Teachers should be paid proportionally more, as should child-care workers, professors, and all hard-working people. It seems to me that British Social Security Minister John Moore's statement about relative inequality is misleading. We should be thinking about relative equality. Little is relative about inequality. In effect, the writer is arguing that the term relative inequality is vague, and objectionably so. The freeloading term. Years ago, the philosopher Bertrand Russell introduced what he called the emotive conjugation. Here's one example. I am firm, you are obstinate, he is pig-headed. This conjugation reveals an important truth about human behavior. We are often more lenient in appraising our own behavior than in appraising that of others. So when I refuse to go along with your suggestion that we go to a movie, I am being firm. But when you refuse to go along with my suggestion that we go to a movie, you are being obstinate. This illustrates a point of interest to logicians, how the same behavior can be described from various points of view. Labels are crucial, in life no less than in argumentation. The term firm has a commendable air to it. The term pig-headed has nothing to recommend it. We like people who are firm and dislike those who are pig-headed. The logical point to note is that words and terms are loaded, in the sense that many of their uses, not all, carry with them an evaluative component. Many words are, by convention, loaded with emotional and psychological fright. As long as the arguer earns the right to rely on these associations by providing the requisite evidence for their applicability, there is no problem. However, such terms are easily abused, often thrown into an argument without any justification being given. They appear to lend support to a conclusion, but really they are present in the argument the way freeloaders are. They haven't paid their way. More precisely, the arguer hasn't paid for them. When this happens, we have the fallacy we call the freeloading term. The following ad, sponsored by a tobacco industry lobby, appeared in a national news magazine. The lead question was, do cigarette companies want kids to smoke? The copy in the ad then went on to read, no, as a matter of policy. No, as a matter of policy. No, as a matter of practice. No, as a matter of fact. No. All of us need a time of growing up to develop the mature judgment to do so many things, like driving, voting, raising a family, and knowing when to make an informed decision about all sorts of adult activities. In our view, smoking is an adult custom, and the decision to smoke should be based on mature and informed individual freedom of choice. The use of the phrase adult custom to classify, label, or describe smoking puts smoking in the class of things like planning and taking a vacation or going to dinner, things that kids don't normally do. Once the ad has succeeded in describing smoking this way, it has done a lot to win the reader over to the ad's unexpressed conclusion that society has no business interfering with people's right to smoke. Should that classification remain unchallenged? Has the advertiser earned the right to use the term adult custom? In view of the pleasant connotation of the term custom and the unpleasant realities that surround the habit of smoking, both in terms of its impact on health and the environment and the developing groundswell of anti-smoking sentiment, we think the term adult custom is not justified here. If we consider other adult customs, we find that they carry either a neutral or a positive association to their meaning. Dating, for example, is an adult custom, as is buying goods on credit. On the other hand, murder is a practice pretty well restricted to adults, but would it be called a custom? Given these problems with the term adult custom, the advertisement, if taken as an argument, commits the fallacy of the freeloading term. The conditions for this fallacy are listed in the box. The freeloading term. 1. The arguer labels something, a person, an act, an event, or a situation, using a term that has an evaluation built into it. 2. The evaluation plays a role in supporting the conclusion. 3. The arguer uses this term without any support or without adequate justification. 4. The arguer should have supported the term. Here is another example and our application of the conditions listed in the box. This letter, adapted from one that appeared in a community where there is a university, is largely self-explanatory. 3 weeks ago, I overheard a conversation at the bus stop. One male university student was loudly relating the day's fun in the laboratory. It seems this morally depraved student had been amusing himself by dropping a half-anesthetized cat from the laboratory bench. The student, now reaching an amused and feverish pitch in his voice, loudly noted to all in the bus shelter that the cat had not landed on its feet. Perhaps professional help is in order for this pitiful human specimen? Platitudes and assurances from the head of the biology department, who said, "I assure you there was no suffering," when informed of what had been overheard, produces no solace for our suffering feline. Surely something must be done to stop this sort of thing from happening again. There are a number of dimensions to this argument, but for the most, direct your attention to the first paragraph, where the arguer suggests that professional help is in order for the student, whom the arguer classifies as this pitiful human specimen. The basis for this classification is the testimony of one student about the events that took place in the laboratory. The same reasoning is used to justify the claim that the student in question is morally depraved. In our view, both of these claims demonstrate the fallacy of the freeloading term, because they satisfy the 3 conditions. Condition 1 is satisfied. The writer uses the terms morally depraved and pitiful human specimen to describe the student, and both of these terms have evaluations built into them. Both suggest an adverse judgment on the student. Condition 2 is satisfied. If we accept these terms, then we are more likely to accept the writer's conclusion that something must be done to alter the treatment of animals in the laboratories. Condition 3 is satisfied. The writer uses these terms without sufficient justification. First, we need to be clear just what it means to call someone morally depraved. This is the strongest possible rebuke to level at someone. It means that they are totally lacking in moral sense. What justification does the writer have for this charge? Let us suppose that the student did indeed drop the cat from a bench, i.e., the student did knowingly inflict some amount of pain on the cat. Is that sufficient evidence to warrant the application of the term morally depraved? We think not. We don't defend what the student allegedly did. Such behavior certainly indicates a moral flaw, but we don't think this one incident provides adequate justification for this moral condemnation, which is the strongest possible censure. If this student is morally depraved, what term is left to describe Hitler? Thus, we conclude that the arguer was guilty of the fallacy of using freeloading terms when he or she used the terms morally depraved and pitiful human specimen. The arguer does not have enough evidence for the application of these condemnatory terms. The crucial point is that if an arguer uses highly charged evaluative language that is problematic or controversial to advance a conclusion, he or she must justify its use. On the other hand, you, as a critic of argument, must be fair and even-handed, which means not jumping on every instance of spicy language. First, stop to think whether the language plays a central role in the argument. And, of course, writers often use such language in perfectly valid ways. For instance, elsewhere in the letter we have just been discussing, the writer stated, "I should not be leveling my indignant salvo entirely on the biology department." Two terms here carry an evaluative component. Indignant means angry because of unjust treatment, and salvo means a burst. But the use of such terms is unobjectionable here. After all, the writer is referring to herself or himself and should know whether or not these terms are appropriate. To conclude, we want to underscore the importance of being responsible in your use of language and in your selection of terms. As we have said, labels are important. They do a lot of work for us. Remember how the word custom, when used to describe the smoking habit, can go a long way towards suggesting that smoking is really rather innocuous. That being so, it is important to make sure that the labels don't do too much work for us. We must use them with due regard for the evidence and justification sometimes required. The continuing debate about abortion provides good illustrative material. The terms that have gained currency in this debate, pro-choice and pro-life, both carry evaluative freight. The idea imparted by the word pro-choice is that the other side is against choice. The idea buried in pro-life is that the other side is anti-life. In each case, we believe the impression created by the label is false. Even if you disagree, you have to concede that the judgments buried underneath the labels can be contentious and need to be supported. But once the label gains currency, the need for such justification is lost. If we examine these fallacies from the view of the RSA triangle, we find that ambiguity, equivocation, and vagueness are violations of the acceptability requirement. You ought not to accept as a premise or a conclusion a statement whose meaning you do not understand. Use of the freeloading term is typically a violation of the acceptability requirement also, although even if the arguer provides some support for the term, and hence is not guilty of violating the acceptability requirement, that support may not be relevant, meaning a violation of the relevance requirement has occurred, or it may not be sufficient, and hence a violation of the sufficiency requirement has occurred.